Welcome back. In this lesson you will learn how to draw trees and how to put it all together in a landscape drawing with a good balanced composition. You'll do this by using the elements and principles of art, which I'll explain, and by using the rule of thirds. Composition refers to the organization, arrangement, and combination of objects within the border. The border is also called a format. And you want to bring the viewer's eyes to your center of interest. So in this case, in Rembrandt's etching of the three trees done in 1643, this is the main focus. So the storm over here on this side is forcing the eye to come this direction. Normally we read from left to right. If you're looking at a drawing or painting with a road starting down in here or a river, your eye might start down here. But in this case, with the horizon line there, we start over in this side, and the storm is forcing our eye this direction. And these lines in the clouds bring our eye this direction. So we come this way, we see the trees, and we go along here and back up again. So it's keeping our eye within the format and the center of interest of the three trees. Notice that there's a bigger space here between these two trees and these two. Notice the sky holes in between the clusters of the leaves, and this gap here. The branches and the leaves don't come all the way around and make like a lollipop shape. So it makes it more interesting when you have gaps like that and that. It also helps the viewer to be able to see through and see the sky in the background. So it's more tied together, the foreground and the background. So the rule of thirds is another thing that can help in making a good composition. If you notice, the horizon line here is 2/3 of the way down the composition or the format, or 1/3 up, right across here. So sometimes you'll see a landscape with the horizon line way up here in the top third. This is because when it's divided this way, it makes for a more interesting composition. So if you look in this example of this still life, you'll see that the format is divided into thirds, horizontally and vertically. And then where the two lines cross, those are called power points. So if part of your subject comes close to or is right on a power point, it's even more effective. So if you look back at Rembrandt's and you see where the third is, right about here and right about here, these trees just about come close to that power point. If you notice here, this candle here is right on this line as well. So this is what makes for a more interesting composition when you think about the rule of thirds, and you can also use the rule of thirds when you're taking photographs. If you're having somebody walking on the beach, you want to take a picture of them, here's the beach, try not to have them in the center of your picture. Have them a little bit over off to the side, and you'll have a much more interesting composition. So then the way the elements and the principles of art work together, the principles of art are the building blocks or arrangement of the use of the elements. And I have a list that I'm going to be sending you. The elements, we've already learned a lot about those. Line or contour line, shape, space, texture, and value are ones that we have already discussed in the previous videos. And so, for example, you have a lot of contrast here in the value. The trees are very dark against a lighter sky. So that makes these trees really stand out. If this background was closer to this value, then the trees wouldn't stand out very well. So when you make the different elements work together to have good principles, then you have a good composition. For example, shapes are arranged to create a balanced composition. So the shapes of these trees are balanced by this big area here of the storm. This big area, shape of the sky, is balanced by the dark area of the foreground. Texture or line can be arranged to create a pattern. So sometimes, like for example in the still life that we did with the big vase, it had a pattern all the way across the vase. So in drawing that, you create a pattern. And pattern is one of the principles of art, and texture is one of the elements of art. And so you'll see how the elements and the principles work together, but the main principle is balance. If you have a composition that's not balanced, and it doesn't mean balance like in scales when you're putting food on one side of the scale and some more food on the other side of the scale, and you want them to be exactly the same weight. That's not the kind of balance we're talking about. If 3 trees like this were drawn on this side with space in the middle, it would be balanced like on a scale, but it would not be balanced for artwork. It would not look good. It would look like somebody folded the paper in half and just put the same thing on both sides, and it just would not look good. Okay, so now you've had a chance to see a little bit about the elements and principles of art and the rule of thirds. So since you've learned already about mountains, rocks, rivers, winding roads and winding rivers, and buildings to put in your landscape, you're going to need to know how to put different trees in. So you already saw this one here of Rembrandt. So now this one is by Rembrandt also, and you can see that there's a big cluster of trees, or just one very large tree, and some other trees. So again, just about like 3 clusters, not exactly in the center, and then the horizon line again is on this lower third. Notice the reflections, streaks going across with spaces in between to show that it's reflection in water. Here's an example of John Constable's. Notice the sky holes. That really helps to bring the viewer through and to see what's in the background. Notice also the road that comes around brings the eye back in there so that they want to, in a way, to explore and see what else is behind there. Here's one by Van Gogh. There aren't any leaves on these trees, but you notice that the trunks and the branches are not just straight, but they have a lot of irregularities that make it very interesting. Okay, here's a pencil sketch of like a juniper tree, and again, you've used hatch marks before, and these are very broad hatch marks. Notice all this side is dark. The light is coming from this side. You can even see it here in this little bush. The light's coming from this side. The shadows are cast this direction. And then here, lighter strokes. Same thing as the lines are hatch marks. But notice there's gaps again and sky holes that helps make the complete tree. Here's an example of another tree where this is more blended, say with a blending stump or tissue, and then still though there's still sky holes throughout, and then the branches are done darker. Here's an example that shows a little bit more texture in the bark and all of the leaves, the clusters of the leaves. When you draw a tree, you don't need to draw every individual leaf, but you give indications of leaves, and I'll show you about that in just a minute. But again, notice that there's sky holes throughout, a light source coming this way on the trunk so that the whole trunk isn't solid, but it shows light on this one side here. Now, here is an example of how to draw the different leaves. And you can see that these are just little loops that are drawn. Here, the little loops have a little bit more of a leaf shape, and a lot of them have darkened areas to show shadows. And then here, these are just little teeny strokes, a little bit more than a dot, and then that gives the impression of clusters of leaves. So again, you don't have to draw every individual leaf. Here's an example of a drawing that I did of a pine tree, and it shows strokes like hatch marks going upward, and what you want to do is, it's called a flick. And when you're drawing, you can use this for drawing hair, and you can use it for drawing grasses and pine needles. You start at the bottom, and then when you come up quickly, and you lift up your pencil. So I'm going to show you with the pencil here. So you see the very end is very light and thin, and the bottom is darker. And that's how I did these different ones in here. So again, you just start at the bottom, more pressure, and then you lift up. It's called a flick. So then here is an example of another tree, and you can see the light sources coming from here because there's light on the trunk here and some shading on this side. And again, you see just not individual leaves drawn, but little squiggly lines, darker areas where there's cast shadows from branches and clusters of trees up above, and the lower parts of the clusters have shaded spots, and the upper part, because of the light coming from up above and this direction, it's making the tops of these clusters a little bit lighter where the light's hitting them. Here's an example of how I started to draw that tree. Excuse me a minute here. And you can see that I drew little teeny marks, little teeny short hatch marks for the trunk, and darker ones on the side for the shaded side or the shadow. And then you can see little teeny marks for the clusters of the trees and lighter ones for the higher part where the light is coming in. So what you want to do is you want to start with your basic shape of your tree, and then start putting in your shadows and your leaf clusters after you get the basic shape put in. Here's another example of like an oak tree perhaps. Notice again all the sky holes, and individual leaves are not drawn. A lot of little fuzzy marks like this were drawn, and then darker ones for the shaded parts. What can be really interesting is when the tree trunks are lighter and the branches and the leaves behind them are darker. That really helps for high contrast and really makes them stand out. Here's another example of the tree trunks are lighter with strong contrast, dark areas behind so that they really stand out. Notice that the reflection is straight down for these straight trees. This one isn't showing up. It's further back. It doesn't appear to be showing up too much in the reflection. So that also, if you notice, the pine boughs are a whole bunch of hatch marks again, just to show the different needles, so to speak. But you don't have to draw every single needle. You can just quickly draw hatch marks, draw darker ones where it's in shadow, and lighter areas or more space between your hatch marks to show contrast and where the light is hitting them. Here's an example of one that I drew, again with hatch marks. And you notice that pine boughs don't just go to the right and to the left of the trunk, but they come in front of the trunk as well. And so that is important so that the tree looks more three-dimensional. I didn't darken this side as much as I did over here. These areas have dark at the bottom and lighter at the top. This just is very flat, So you would want to go another step further in this branch also and darken the bottom areas like is on this one here. Then it makes it look more three-dimensional. Here's another example of another tree that's interesting without leaves, and it's kind of like Van Gogh's trees with all of the gnarly branches and limbs coming out. So in this photograph, notice that this tree is on the third, and then the horizon is on a third also, making for a more interesting composition. Okay, now that you've learned about drawing trees, different types, you want to put your mountains and your river and your trees and rocks, maybe even a building all together in a finished composition, a landscape. But instead of spending a lot of time on one drawing that's maybe a full sheet of paper, and then you find out when you get almost done that you're not real happy with how it's put together, a good thing to do is to do what's called thumbnail sketches. So they're quick drawings, they don't have a lot of detail, they explore different viewpoints, proportions, where you want to put your different shapes. Usually it's the same subject, but different views. So it could be close up, could be further away, a lot further away, that sort of thing. It could be portrait, or it could be landscape version. When it's horizontal like this, that's called landscape. When it's vertical, it's called portrait. And sometimes your composition would be better this way or this way. So you try a whole bunch of different very little. They can be business card size or they could be a little bit larger, but you don't spend a lot of time on them. They're done very quickly, just to explore your thoughts and ideas for different compositions. Okay, now this drawing, done in 1859 by William H. Hart, is one that I thought would be kind of fun to draw and show you how you can try to decide what kind of composition you would want to do. So say you're actually looking at this for real at a riverbank. You don't have to put the people in. There's a couple people here, but you don't have to put them in. But you have a viewfinder. So say you want to just do this part. You might like that for a composition. Or you might like just this part right here. Or maybe you like this part right here. So this is what's important to do, is to take a square with a cutout like this or an old picture frame, and you can use it to get an idea of what kind of a composition you would like. And if you want exact proportions, you take this corner and you go straight across to this corner, and then you'll have the same proportions if you're shrinking it down or enlarging it. So I did a couple thumbnail sketches. Mine are a little bit bigger than the ones in the example. So I have one here where the trees are taking up a little bit more space, and the mountain is cut off right there. And then this one here where the trees take up a little less space, and these are both landscape format. And then here's one where I changed to portrait view, and the trees take up the majority, and then the mountain is pretty much out of the picture. So you can look at all of these and try to decide which one do you want. Well, in actuality, I kind of liked this one the way it is already, but some of the other ones would have worked. I think this one here is pretty good, but I decided to draw this, but I don't like this tree and this little hill line up. And when two things line up, and especially if they touch each other, it's called a tangent. And then they kind of compete for attention. So when I drew it, I don't know how much you're going to be able to see this because it's pretty light, but I moved, the tree is actually right here, and the mountain, I moved it over a little bit, so it's over. I put a little building in right here, and then I have the trees here and a couple rocks. So this is how you put together a complete landscape, is you can do thumbnail sketches to block out a couple different ideas that you might like, and then you start to lay it in a little bit at a time and then get darker and darker as you go. Here's an example of, this is a book that's in the library called Drawing with Lee Ames, and you can see how the sketch is very light in the beginning and it gets darker and darker and darker as it goes along all the way to the end here. So that way, if say you were here and you darkened this side of the building so it was this dark, and you found out that maybe you drew it a little bit wrong, you didn't like the position, you wanted to make it a little bit bigger or change the angle of the roof, if you had this dark way in the beginning, you wouldn't be able to change it. So you do a little bit at a time as you go and darken as you go. If you stop your drawing when the values are this light, it's not going to look like a finished drawing. It's going to stand out a lot more if it has a lot more contrast like this. So after you've practiced drawing the rocks, the mountains, some buildings, the river with reflections, then try putting them together. Try to perhaps even take some photographs of some of the beautiful area around Portola and do some sketches. Do some thumbnail sketches before you do a final drawing, and then take your best thumbnail sketch and enlarge it to a final drawing. Make sure that you have a wide range of values so that it really stands out. Include high contrast, and take a break from it when you think it's done. Look at it a few hours later or the next day, and sometimes that helps you to see where you would like to make some changes. And then hopefully you can move on and do a whole bunch more. So I hope you've enjoyed these lessons, and I've enjoyed sharing this with you. And I'm going to be sending you a whole sheet of landscape rules and tips to help with depth and many more things. So look for that in your email. And if you're not getting an email from these lessons, give me a call at the library and I can print it out for you, and you can come and pick it up if you like.